I'm Charlie Saunier from the Renegades of Puck, and this is the 20th Century Hockey Chronicle. The precise origin of hockey has remained a mystery to historians. Wide-ranging theories have pinpointed Montreal, Halifax, and Kingston as the most likely sites of first games in North America, but nothing has been proven. Likewise, the very first hockey leagues, primitive in nature and loosely formed, are just as difficult to isolate. What is certain is this: as the game emerged from its shell, amateur groups organized in Quebec City, Kingston, Montreal, and Halifax starting in the late 1870s. Within a decade, hockey's popularity had grown so rapidly that amateur leagues sprouted on both sides of the 49th parallel. Organized hockey took a giant stride forward in 1893. That year, Lord Stanley of Preston, Canada's Governor-General, offered a silver cup to be presented to the premier team in Canada. At first, only amateur teams battled for the coveted trophy because professional hockey was pretty much non-existent. However, in 1904, a dentist in Houghton, Michigan, got the bright idea that play-for-pay hockey would interest the public more than the Simon Pure variety. Dr. Jack Gibson obtained financial backing and organized North America's first full-blown professional organization, the International Hockey League. It was an odd mix that included Michigan towns of Houghton, Sault Ste. Marie, Portage Lake, and Laurium, as well as Pittsburgh and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Although the International League was short-lived, it proved to be a beacon that other hockey groups soon followed. As more and more pros seeped into the amateur ranks, the foremost amateur leagues read the handwriting that changed their positions. In 1908, the powerful Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association went the professional route, and soon it became clear to the Stanley Cup trustees that the mug soon would be awarded to the best pro teams and not amateurs. The most important of the new leagues was born in 1909. The National Hockey Association was organized with teams in Montreal, Renfrew, Cobalt, and Haileybury. Yet another pro league, the Canadian Hockey Association, was organized the same year. It granted franchise teams in Ottawa, Quebec, and Montreal. No less important was the westward move of the Patrick brothers, Frank and Lester, who organized the Pacific Coast Hockey Association in 1911. Its original clubs included New Westminster, Vancouver, and Victoria. The PCHA immediately signed marquee players like Newsy Lalonde, Hugh Lehman, and Harry Hyland. Prior to World War I, the NHA and PCHA leaders agreed to organize a playoff between their top teams, the winner of which would take the Stanley Cup. In 1917, Seattle of the PCHA became the first American team to win Lord Stanley's Bowl, indicating that pro hockey would become a significant moneymaker on both sides of the border. The only question to be answered was, which league would rule the sport? Prior to 1900, a face-off began when the puck was placed on the ice by the ref, who then had to make certain each center was lined up correctly. However, this often led to sticks in tender areas of the ref's anatomy. Thankfully, referee Fred Waghorn debuted a new method in 1900. He simply dropped the puck, allowing them to do as they darn well pleased, he said. The new face-off method was eventually adopted. Henry J. Trilly was captain of the Montreal Shamrocks for their first Stanley Cup wins in 1899 and 1900. Tree was known as the powerhouse on the lacrosse field and the football field, as well as on the ice. He took the notion of the three-man line seriously in the time when hockey was a seven-man game. Under Tree's captainship, the Rover was not a footloose forward. He was truly a roving player. On February 20th, 1901, Russell Bowie of the Montreal Victorias scored 7 goals in the game and was well positioned to dominate the CAHL. He finished the season with 24 goals, 14 more than his nearest rival. His entire career was played with the Montreal Victorias, where he averaged almost 3 goals per game. As an amateur in Berlin, Ontario, Jack Gibson, along with his teammates, accepted a silver dollar as a token of his town's appreciation for their league championship in 1902. The league brass frowned upon the gift and banned all the players from amateur play. Gibson's response came in 1905 when he organized the first pro ice hockey league. In the year 1900, referee Fred Waghorn introduces the modern face-off, dropping the puck between the players' sticks rather than placing it on the ice and risking injury. The Canadian Amateur Hockey League adopts the use of the goal net. The Montreal Shamrocks go 7-1 to win the regular season CAHL title. The Shamrocks claim this year's Stanley Cup. The cup, donated by Lord Stanley of Preston in 1893, is awarded each year to the champion of amateur Canadian hockey. To attain the Stanley Cup, the Shamrocks defeat Winnipeg 2-1, then outscore Halifax 21-2 in a 2-game total goal series. Shamrocks ace Harry Tree scores 12 goals in 5 playoff games during the Stanley Cup Challenge. In the year 1901, the Ottawa Senators win the CAHL regular season title with a 7-0 record, but they fail to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. Russell Bowie of the Montreal Victorias leads the CAHL with 24 goals. Ottawa goalie Bruce Hutton leads the CAHL with a 2.90 goals against average. The Stanley Cup Challenge features the Montreal Shamrocks and the Winnipeg Victorias, which the Vics win 2-0. The Intercollegiate Hockey League is formed in the United States. Members include Columbia, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. In the year 1902, Winnipeg defends its 1901 Stanley Cup in January 1902, defeating Toronto Wellingtons in 2 games. The Montreal AAA club wins the CAHL regular season title with a 6-2 record, ahead of second-place Ottawa with a 5-3 record. Art Hooper of the AAAs leads the league in goals with 17, scoring 9 against the Montreal Shamrocks on January 5, 1902. The Montreal AAAs defeat Winnipeg in 3 games to win the 1902 Stanley Cup. Player Jack Gibson leaves amateur hockey and opens a dentistry practice in Michigan. He will eventually re-enter hockey as the first professional owner. Future Montreal Canadian star Howie Morenz is born on June 21, 1902 in Mitchell, Ontario. In the year 1903, Ottawa and Winnipeg tie for the CAHL regular season title with records of 6-2. The famed Ottawa Silver 7 team features Art Moore and Harvey Pulford on defense and forward line of Dave Gilmore, Suddy Gilmore, and Billy Gilmore, the superstar Frank McGee. Russell Bowie scores 22 goals for the Montreal Victorias, including 7 against Quebec on January the 10th and 6 against the Montreal Shamrocks 2 weeks later. Frank McGee of Ottawa is second in goals with 14, scoring 5 against Winnipeg on February the 17th of 1903. The Montreal AAAs defend their 1902 Stanley Cup in February 1903 as they defeat the Winnipeg Victorias in 4 games. The Ottawa Silver 7 wins the 1903 Stanley Cup by defeating the Montreal Victorias and the Rat Portage Thistles. In 1904, the Federal Amateur Hockey League is formed. Teams include the Ottawa Senators, the Montreal Wanderers, the Capitals, the Nationals, and a club in Cornwall. Quebec wins the CAHL title with a 7-1 record, while the Montreal Wanderers are 6-0 in the FAHL. The Montreal Victorias' Russell Bowie leads the CAHL in goals with 27. Blair Russell of the Montreal Victorias scores 7 goals against the Montreal Shamrocks on January 2, 1904. While Quebec's Herb Jordan strafes the Shams with 8 goals on January the 19th. In the playoffs, Ottawa defeats the Winnipeg Rowing Club and then Toronto of the Ontario League. Ottawa's playoff series with the Wanderers is canceled after a Game 1 tie. As teams can't decide where the tie game should be replayed, Ottawa then beats Brandon to retain the cup. Wheeler enjoys Stanley Cup joyride. The Montreal Winged Wheelers owned the Stanley Cup for a year, winning it from the Winnipeg Victorias in March of 1902 and losing the Ottawa Silver 7 in March 1903. Montreal was captained by Dickie Boone, a crafty poke checker with tremendous speed. The logo of the team, the winged wheel, was resurrected many years later when James Norris, an alumnus of the team, formed the Detroit Red Wings. 1905, the Montreal Victorias win the CAHL title with a 9-1 record, edging Quebec with a record of 8-2. The Ottawa Senators take the FAHL with a record of 7-1. Russell Bowie scores a CAHL high 26 goals for the Victorias, while Frank McGee leads the FAHL with 17 goals. Former amateur player Jack Gibson organizes the International Hockey League, the game's first pro league. The IHL has teams in the Michigan cities of Portage Lake, Laurium, Houghton, and Sault Ste. Marie, as well as Pittsburgh and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The Ottawa Silver 7 meets Dawson City, which has traveled more than 4,000 miles in the Stanley Cup Challenge. In Game 2 against Dawson City, Frank McGee scores 14 goals as Ottawa wins 23-2. Ottawa later beats Rat Portage to retain the Stanley Cup. Except for a one-year stint for Haileybury of the NHA, goalie Patty Morin played his hockey in Quebec from 1902 to 1917. In 1904, he powered his Bulldogs to a 7-1 regular season record, best in the CAHL. Morin was known as a stand-up goalie who frequently used his stick to paddle away enemy shots. Patty led Quebec to Stanley Cups in 1912 and 13 and was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1958. 1906. The CHL combines with Ottawa and the Montreal Wanderers to form the Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association. Ottawa and the Wanderers tie for first place with records of 9-1. Smith Falls takes the FAHL title with a 7-0 mark thanks to goalie Percy Lesueur, a 1.90 goals against average. Ottawa's Harry Smith leads the ECAHA in goals with 38, including an 8-goal explosion against the Montreal Shamrocks on February the 17th. Tommy Smith of the FAHL's Ottawa Vics leads his league in goals with 12, thanks to an 8-goal game against Brockville on February the 23rd. Ottawa defends its 1905 Stanley Cup in February 1906. The Silver Seven beat Queen's University in 2 games by a combined 28-14 score before beating Smith Falls in 2 straight. The Montreal Wanderers win the 1906 Cup in March by beating Ottawa 12-10 in a 2-game series. In the 1906-1907 hockey seasons, in a Stanley Cup Challenge in December 1906, the Montreal Wanderers beat Glasgow 17-5 in a 2-game series. The Montreal Wanderers win the ECAHA title with a 10-0 record, while the Ottawa Montagnards top the FAHL with an 8-1 mark. Ernie Russell leads the ECAHA in goals with 42 thanks to 2 8-goal games against the Montreal Shamrocks and a 6-goaler versus Quebec. Cornwall's Owen McCourt leads the FAHL in goals with 16, including 7 versus Morrisburg in February. Owen McCourt is killed when Ottawa's Charles Mason hits him in the head. Mason is charged with manslaughter, but is acquitted. The Wanderers lost twice to Kenora before it's determined that Kenora is using ringers. In a rematch, Montreal beats Kenora to win the Stanley Cup. In March 1906, the Silver Seven stranglehold on the Stanley Cup was finally broken. It was the Montreal Wanderers who yanked it from their grasp, beating Ottawa 12-10 in a total goal series. Over the next 2.5 years, the Wanderers would dominate the game, playing 8 challenge matches for the Cup and losing only 1 series, that being to the Kenora Thistles. Lester Patrick and Moore Johnson were among the big names on the Wanderers squad. 1907-1908, the Montreal Wanderers repeat as ECAHA champs with a record of 8-2, while Toronto wins the Ontario Professional Hockey League title with a 10-2 record. Ottawa's Marty Walsh ties Russell Bowie of the Montreal Victorias for the ECAHL goal title with a total of 28. Marty Walsh has the ECAHA's biggest game, a 7-goal outburst against the Montreal Wanderers. Newsy Lalonde, a future NHL superstar, leads the OPHL with 29 goals, including 8 in a game against Brantford. The Wanderers defeat 3 challengers for the Stanley Cup. They first trounced the Ottawa Victorias in a total goals playoff 22-4. The Wanderers dispatched the Winnipeg Maple Leafs 20-8 in 2 games and Toronto 6-4 in 1 game to retain the Stanley Cup. 1908-1909. In December 1908, the Montreal Wanderers meet their 4th Stanley Cup challenger of the calendar year. They beat Edmonton in 2 games. No longer an all-amateur league, the Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association is renamed the Eastern Canada Hockey Association. The ECHA is down to 4 teams. The Ottawa Senators win the regular season title with a 10-2 record, ahead of the Montreal Wanderers with a 9-3 record. Brantford and Galt tie atop the OPHL with 10-4 records. The title is decided by a 1-game playoff, which is won by Galt 7-1. Ottawa's Marty Walsh leads the ECHA in goals with 38. Brantford's Tommy Smith tops the OPHL with 33. The Ottawa Senators are awarded the Stanley Cup by virtue of their ECHA title. The Winnipeg Shamrocks hope to challenge Ottawa, but arrangements to meet can't be made. The Ottawa Hockey Club sat and stewed while Montreal Wanderers dominated Stanley Cup play from 1906 to 1908. Because of a rule change, however, the winner in the ECHA in 1908-1909 would automatically receive the cup. Ottawa won the title and thus the cup by virtue of its 10-2 record, 1 game better than Montreal at 9-3. This new Ottawa team, the Senators, featured Hall of Famers Percy Lasour, Cyclone Taylor, Billy Gilmore, Marty Walsh, and Bruce Stewart. 1909-1910, the ECHA becomes the CHA, which includes Ottawa, Quebec, all Montreal, the Montreal Shamrocks, and the Nationals. The National Hockey Association debuts with teams in Renfrew, Cobalt, Haileybury, and Montreal, the Wanderers, and the Canadians. In January 1910, the CHA gives up its efforts. 2 of its teams, Ottawa and the Shamrocks, join the NHA. The Wanderers win the NHA race with an 11-1 mark. Newsy Lalonde, who plays for both the Wanderers and Renfrew, leads the NHA with 38 goals, including 9 in a game. Ottawa defends its 1909 Stanley Cup in January of 1910 by defeating both Galt 15-4 and Edmonton 21-11 in total goal series. In March, after the NHA season is over, the Wanderers meet OPHL champion Berlin for the 1910 Stanley Cup. The Wanderers win 7-3. 1910-1911, the Haileybury and Cobalt teams merge and become the Quebec Bulldogs. Meanwhile, the lowly Montreal Shamrocks drop out of the NHA. Nuzi Lalonde joins the Montreal Canadiens, and future star Georges Vezina makes his debut for the Habs. On February 25th, Wanderers defender Art Ross knocks Eddie Oatman of Quebec cold, inciting a brawl that requires police intervention. Ottawa, with a record of 13-3, finishes first in the NHA as Ottawa's Marty Walsh leads the league in total goals with 37. In Stanley Cup action, Galt of the OPHL beats Port Hope of the Eastern Ontario League, while Port Arthur of the New Ontario League tops Prince Albert of the Saskatchewan League. Ottawa routs Galt 7-4 and Port Arthur 13-4 to win the Cup. Marty Walsh scores 10 against Port Arthur. Montreal Wanderers defenseman Art Ross was not quite as demure as one would gather from his photo. In February 1911, Ross knocked out Quebec's Eddie Oatman, triggering a brawl that was broken up by police. Ross was quite a rabble-rouser in his playing days. In February 1915, he and Minnie McGiffin got into such a heated brawl during the game that cops came and arrested them. Frank Patrick, along with his brother Lester, is one of the most important figures in the history of pro hockey. In 1911, the Patrick brothers began a hockey empire on the west coast of Canada and the United States. The Pacific Coast Association reigned for 13 years on the Sunshine Coast and was a formidable rival to the NHA and NHL. Frank was among the leading players, coaches, managers, and owners of the circuit. 1911-1912, Renfrew drops out of the NHA and two teams from Toronto are added. The O'Brien Cup, named after NHA founder Ambrose O'Brien, becomes the NHA's championship trophy. The NHA switches to six-man hockey as it eliminates the rover position. The Wanderers' Ernie Johnson and Harry Hyland are branded as outlaws for jumping to New Westminster of the new Pacific Coast Hockey Association. Quebec, with a record of 10-8, wins the NHA. Ottawa's Skeen Ronan leads with goals totaling in 35. New Westminster, with a record of 9-6, takes the PCHA title as Vancouver's Nuzi Lalonde leads in goals with 27. Moncton of the Maritime Professional Hockey League challenges Quebec for the Stanley Cup, but Jack McDonald scores 9 goals in 2 games as Quebec wins the series 17-3. 1912-1913. Scoring star Harry Hyland re-enters the NHA with the Wanderers after just 1 year in the PCHA, and the Canadiens reacquire Nuzi Lalonde from Vancouver. Ottawa debuts a pair of future Hall of Famers, Punch Broadbent and goalie Clint Benedict. Quebec, with a record of 16-4, takes first place in the NHA as the Bulldogs' Joe Malone leads the league in goals with 43. Harry Hyland scores 8 goals in 1 game against Quebec. Victoria wins the PCHA title as Tom Durnerdale wins the scoring race with 27 goals. Quebec challenges Sydney for the Stanley Cup. Joe Malone scores 9 goals in Game 1 as the Bulldogs breeze to a 25 total goals victory. In an exhibition series, Quebec loses 2 out of 3 games to Victoria of the PCHA. It's a preview of the Stanley Cup Challenge to come. Phantom Joe explodes for 43 goals. Joe Malone was not exactly new to the game, but his first explosive goal-scoring season came in 1912-1913 with the Quebec Bulldogs. The 23-year-old poured in 43 goals in 20 NHA contests, including 7 in a game against Toronto. When the Bulldogs played Sydney that spring in a Stanley Cup series, Malone potted 9 goals in 1 game. Malone was so swift on the ice that he earned the nickname Phantom Joe. 1913-1914. In the NHA, goalies are not allowed to leave their feet to make saves and risk penalties for doing so. Also, assists are recorded for the first time. The NHA and PCHA come to terms on a Stanley Cup Series format to decide hockey's overall champion. The Canadiens and Toronto tie for the NHA title with records of 13-7. Quebec's Tommy Smith wins the scoring race, 39 goals, including 9 in 1 single game. Toronto beats the Canadiens 6-2 in a total goals playoff. Jack Walker scores a hat-trick in Game 2. The city of Toronto did not cherish a Stanley Cup until 1914 when the Toronto Blue Shirts from the NHA used this puck to beat the Victoria Cougars from the PCHA for the coveted mug. The Blue Shirts' road to the Cup wasn't easy after finishing the 1913-14 NHA season tied with the Montreal Canadiens. Toronto had to defeat them in a 2-game total goals series, which they did, 6-2. 3 days later, Victoria arrived for a 5-game series, which Toronto swept in 3. 1914-1915. Emmett Quinn is voted the new president of the NHL, while player Art Ross is temporarily banished from hockey after allegedly negotiating with players to form a new league. Ottawa and the Wanderers tie for first place with a record of 14-6, as Ottawa's Clint Benedict has the best goals against average at 3.30. Tommy Smith, splitting the year between Quebec and Ontario, leads the NHL with 39 goals. Tommy Smith had a heck of a year in 1914-15 despite being shuffled around. A regular with Quebec Bulldogs, he was shipped to the Ontarios prior to the season opener. Halfway through the season, Quebec ace Joe Malone sprained his ankle, and Smith went back to Quebec for the balance of the year. Nevertheless, Smith led the NHA in goals with 39 in 19 games. Vancouver wins the PCHA title behind goalie Hugh Lehman and the league best scoring of Mickey McKay, 34 goals overall. Ottawa beats the Wanderers 4-1 in the NHA playoffs before taking on Vancouver for the Stanley Cup. After trouncing Ottawa 6-2 and 8-3 in the first two games, the Vancouver Millionaires rout the Senators 12-3 in Game 3 to win the Stanley Cup. 1915-1916. The Wanderers' Sprague Cleghorn is lost for the year after a collision with Toronto's Ken Randall. Canadiens ace Skeen Ronan is arrested for assaulting Toronto's Alf Skinner. The Canadiens, with a record of 16-7, paced the NHA thanks to the league-high scoring of Newsy Lalonde with 31 goals overall. Edward Newsy Lalonde, who won the NHA scoring title in 1915-1916 with 31 goals for the Montreal Canadiens, was also one of the nastiest players of the day. During one game in 1912-1913, Lalonde slammed Montreal Wanderer Odie Cleghorn into the boards with such force that Odie's teammate and brother Sprague charged across the rink and smashed Newsy across the forehead with his stick. The blow just barely missed Lalonde's eye. The PCHA adds a fourth team, the Seattle Metropolitans, featuring Frank Foyston, but Portland, with a record of 13-5, wins the league title on the goaltending of Tom Murray with a goals against average of 2.80. On February 1st of 1916, Cyclone Taylor and Lloyd Cook of Vancouver each score 6 goals against Victoria. The Canadiens face Portland in a Stanley Cup series that goes 5 games. Montreal's Didier Petrie scores a hat-trick in Game 3, and Portland's Fred Harris does the same in Game 4. The Canadiens win their first cup as Goldie Progers scores the winner in a 2-1 Game 5 nail-biter. 1916-1917. World War I depletes the rosters of several teams and inspires the formation of a new NHA member, the 228th Battalion Team. However, the 228th is soon ordered overseas and leaves after just 10 games. In a game where fighting is as commonplace as scoring, it is reasonable that an Army unit should figure somewhere in its history. In 1916-17, the 228th Battalion had so many former hockey players among its ranks that it was able to field a team in the NHA, although it had to withdraw after 10 games when the men were shipped overseas. Goldie Progers, Eddie Oatman, and Hall of Famer George McNamara skated for the 228th team. Frank Robinson assumes the NHA presidency as Emmett Quinn resigns. Quebec's Joe Malone, Ottawa's Frank Nieboer topped the NHA with 41 goals apiece. Malone rings up 8 goals against the Wanderers. Seattle wins the PCHA title on Harry Holmes' outstanding goaltending. Vancouver's Gordon Roberts wins the scoring title with 43 goals. The Canadiens' first-half champs beat Ottawa, the second-half champs, in the NHA playoffs 7-6 on total goals. The Habs travel to Seattle and take Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Series 8-4. Seattle wins the remaining games 6-1, 4-1, and 9-1 as Bernie Morris scores 14 times in 4 games. The first United States city to hoist a Stanley Cup was, surprise, Seattle. The Metropolitans claimed the prize in 1917 after winning the PCHA title and then beating the Montreal Canadiens in the Stanley Cup Series. The Mets featured Hall of Famers Jack Walker, Frank Foyston, and Hap Holmes, plus Bernie Morris, who scored 14 goals in the Cup Series, and manager Pete Muldoon of the famed Muldoon's Curse. As World War I exploded toward a climax on European battlefields, a more dignified war was taking place on ice rinks and in hockey boardrooms. The goal was to establish dominance over the professional game. Lester and Frank Patrick had done so at the West with their Pacific Coast Hockey Association, but free-for-all of sorts was developing in the East, home of Canada's 2 largest cities, Toronto and Montreal. Clashes over control of the National Hockey Association grew increasingly fierce, mostly because of one individual, Edward Livingstone. Regarded as the George Steinbrenner of his day, Livingstone managed to antagonize every one of his fellow owners. By 1917, they decided that they had had enough. But how to get rid of Livingstone? That was the question. Livingstone had been a franchise holder in Toronto and therefore was a legitimate NHA member. The solution of his foes was subtraction by addition. Livingstone was eliminated as an owner simply by the creation of a new league. The coup d'etat was executed in November 1917 during a meeting at the Windsor Hotel in Montreal. All of the top pro teams, Ottawa Senators, Quebec Bulldogs, Montreal Canadiens, Montreal Wanderers, and Toronto Arenas were represented. Livingstone, though, was kept from the meeting. When the participants finally emerged from the smoke-filled room, they had created a brand new entity, the National Hockey League, with only Quebec taking a temporary sabbatical. Thus, the new NHL embraced Ottawa, Montreal Wanderers and Canadiens, and Toronto. NHA Secretary Frank Calder was named president of the new circuit, and it was off and running. Many of the world's best players graced the new league's rosters. The Wanderers had the immortal Bert Lindsay, father of Hall of Famer Ted. In goal, such aces as Sprague and Odie Cleghorn. The Canadiens led by Joe Malone and Joe Hall, with Newsy Lalonde as the player-manager. Toronto's best included Reg Noble, Corbett Dennehy, and Harry Meeking, while Ottawa boasted Cy Dennehy, Jack Dara, and Eddie Garrard. Unfortunately, the Wanderers never made it through the season, as fire leveled the Montreal Arena on January 2, 1918. Wanderers owner Sam Lichtheim attempted to borrow players from other squads, but when they refused to help, he withdrew his club from the NHL. With a three-team league, the NHL barely survived its maiden season. Nevertheless, it did reach the finish line, and the Toronto Arenas became the first NHL club to qualify for Stanley Cup play. Hosting a series with Vancouver of the PCHA, 5 games later, the NHL had its first Cup winner. Toronto defeated Vancouver 3-2 thanks to the outstanding play of Corbett Dennehy, one of the new league's first stars. The triumph notwithstanding, the NHL still was treading on thin fiscal ice. It now was a question of how long the baby circuit could survive with only 3 teams. The next season, 1918-1919, would hold the answer. I'm Charlie Saunier from the Renegades of Puck, and this has been the 20th Century Hockey Chronicle. If you'd like to support more projects like this, please follow the Renegades of Puck on all social media platforms and also visit renegadesofpuck.com.